Preserved in a glass jar filled with formaldehyde in the psychology department of Cornell University sits one of the most notorious brains in American criminal history. Belonging to a man who could speak 8 languages fluently, translate ancient Greek texts, and formulate complex theories about human linguistics, it measured 1,673 centimeters. Yet with this same brilliant mind, brutal murders that shocked 19th-century America were orchestrated. The brain was that of Edward Howard Rulloff, teacher, doctor, inventor, philologist, and killer. For decades, across New York State, authorities struggled to understand how such calculated evil could coexist with such intellectual brilliance. Tonight, we uncover the chilling truth behind the man newspapers called the genius killer. This is a story of academic ambition funded by blood, where the pursuit of knowledge became an obsession that justified murder. Before we continue with the story of Edward Rulloff and his reign of terror across New York's Finger Lakes region, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We upload new dark mysteries every week, and we'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling us your state or city. The case of Edward Rulloff would forever change how Americans viewed the criminal mind, proving that the mask of scholarly respectability could be worn by evil and that genius itself could become a weapon of destruction. The year was 1842, and alive with opportunity and transformation were the rolling hills of central New York. Sleepy farming communities had been turned into bustling trade centers by the Erie Canal. Meanwhile, the region had been filled with religious fervor and social reform movements by the Second Great Awakening. In this new America, education was becoming the pathway to prosperity, and small towns competed to attract learned men who could elevate their cultural standing. It was into this landscape of hope and progress that a young man named Edward Rulloff arrived in the village of Dryden, just east of Ithaca. To the locals, he seemed like a gift from Providence itself. 23 years old, Rulloff was tall and distinguished-looking, with a commanding presence that immediately set him apart from the rough canal workers and farmers who typically passed through town. His dark hair was meticulously groomed, his clothing was neat and scholarly, and his piercing dark eyes seemed to hold depths of knowledge that impressed everyone he met. When he spoke, it was with the cultured accent of an educated gentleman, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Rarely had the residents of Dryden encountered anyone with such apparent erudition. Extensive knowledge of botany and medicine was claimed by Rulloff. He could recite passages in Latin, Greek, and German with fluid precision and seemed equally comfortable discussing philosophy, literature, and the emerging sciences. When he began delivering lectures on phrenology, the popular pseudoscience of reading character through skull measurements, the townspeople gathered in amazement at his apparent mastery of this fashionable field of study. But secrets that would have horrified his admirers lay beneath this impressive exterior. Born John Edward Howard Ruffson near St. John, New Brunswick around 1819 or 1820, he had already lived a double life before crossing into the United States. A Danish immigrant, his father, Rudolf Rulloffsson, had achieved some prosperity as a justice of the peace, but the family's fortunes had declined after his death in 1827. Early promise as a scholar had been shown by young Edward, devouring books with an insatiable hunger for knowledge that impressed his teachers and neighbors alike. However, his intellectual gifts had been corrupted by an early taste for crime. By the time he reached his teens, Edward had been caught in a series of suspicious fires at the dry goods store where he worked, arson apparently designed to cover up inventory thefts. When he was observed wearing clothing that matched items reported stolen, he was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 2 years in prison. A wake-up call the experience should have been, but instead it became his criminal education, teaching him the value of careful planning and the importance of maintaining a respectable facade. After his release, he had crossed into the United States, abandoning his birth name for the more distinguished Edward Rulloff. More than cosmetic was the change. It represented his transformation from common criminal to something far more dangerous, a predator who could blend seamlessly into respectable society. Time to study and plan had been given to him by his years of imprisonment, emerging with a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate others through displays of learning and charm. In Dryden, quickly established was Rulloff himself as an invaluable member of the community. Employment was found by him as a clerk in the local drugstore, where his apparent knowledge of botanical medicines impressed both his employer and customers. Boundless seemed his learning. He could discuss the latest philosophical works from Europe, analyze political developments with insight, and demonstrate practical knowledge of everything from photography to carpentry. Starved for intellectual stimulation in their rural setting, the community embraced him with an enthusiasm that fed his growing sense of superiority. Rapidly through the region grew his reputation. Farmers consulted him about their crops. Local politicians sought his advice on matters of governance, and prominent families invited him to dinner parties where his conversation was the evening's entertainment. Soon offered to him was the position of headmaster at their local school, a role that would give him not only respectability but access to young minds he could influence and potentially corrupt. Among his pupils was 17-year-old Harriet Shutt, daughter of one of the area's most respected farming families. Considered a rare beauty, even in a region known for its handsome women, was Harriet, tall and slender with long light brown hair that caught the sunlight, pale skin that spoke of genteel upbringing, and hazel eyes that sparkled with intelligence and gentle humor. The kind of refined mannerisms and educated speech that marked her as gentry in this rural community were possessed by her, having been fortunate enough to receive more education than most young women of her time. Through hard work and careful management of their substantial farm holdings, the Shutt family had prospered. Among the area's most prominent citizens they were, known for their generosity to neighbors and their active participation in community affairs. A man of considerable influence, Harriet's father, John Shutt, took pride in his daughter's accomplishments and had high expectations for her future marriage. Everything that was stable and respectable about rural American life in the 1840s was represented by the family. Immediate and intense was the attraction between teacher and student, though it would prove to be built on the most dangerous foundation imaginable. Despite his scholarly demeanor, Rulloff possessed a magnetic charisma that drew people to him like moths to a flame. Utterly charming he could be when it suited his purposes, weaving tales of his travels and studies that painted him as a man of the world who had seen wonders beyond the provincial horizons of central New York. For a young woman like Harriet, living within the comfortable but confining boundaries of rural society, he represented everything exotic and sophisticated that her sheltered life had never offered. But even in these early days of courtship, warning signs that those around them chose to ignore or rationalize away were there. Frightening in its intensity and seemingly unpredictable in its triggers could be Rulloff's temper when provoked. An almost pathological jealousy was displayed by him whenever other men showed even innocent interest in Harriet, and his moods could shift from charming affability to cold, calculating rage in moments. While impressed by his obvious learning and apparent prospects, the Shutt family harbored private doubts about their daughter's suitor that they found difficult to articulate. On December 31, 1843, as heavy snow blanketed the Finger Lakes region and families throughout central New York gathered for New Year's celebrations, Edward Rulloff and Harriet Shutt were united in marriage during a simple but well-attended ceremony at the Shutt family farm. A joyous occasion the wedding should have been, marking the beginning of a promising union between two intelligent young people. But even on this day meant for celebration, Rulloff's true nature began to emerge in ways that should have terrified everyone present. Normally the ceremony itself proceeded until the traditional moment when the minister, following time-honored custom, congratulated the bride with a gentle kiss on the cheek. In that instant, cracked was Rulloff's carefully maintained facade, revealing the violent jealousy that would define their marriage. With such fury did his face darken that several wedding guests stepped back in alarm, and his eyes flashed with a rage so intense and unexpected that it cast a pall over the entire celebration. Here was a man flying into jealous fury over an innocent gesture from a clergyman, behavior that should have warned everyone present of the violence lurking beneath his scholarly exterior. Unsure how to interpret this disturbing outburst, the wedding guests chose to attribute it to wedding day nerves or perhaps the stress of joining a prominent family. But something in her new husband's eyes that chilled her to the bone had been seen by Harriet herself, though she told herself it was merely the intensity of his love for her. Brief and troubled was the honeymoon period that followed, marked by moments of passionate devotion interrupted by flashes of the same terrifying rage that had marked their wedding day. Within months of their marriage, Rulloff had convinced Harriet to move with him to the nearby village of Lansing, ostensibly to give them privacy to build their new life together, but really to isolate his young wife from her family's protective influence. More than a simple change of address represented the move. It was a calculated strategy to cut Harriet off from the support system that might have helped her escape the nightmare her marriage was becoming. In Lansing, set up practice as a botanical physician did Rulloff, using his self-taught knowledge of herbs and medicines to treat local residents who had limited access to formally trained doctors. Rapidly grew his reputation as a healer, and soon prominent families throughout the region were seeking his services for everything from common ailments to serious medical emergencies. Reasonable fees were charged by him, and he seemed genuinely concerned for his patients' welfare, further cementing his reputation as a valuable member of the community. A center of intellectual activity in the small village became the young couple's modest home. Continued his scholarly pursuits did Rulloff, filling their rooms with books on subjects ranging from classical languages to natural philosophy. Hours each day were spent by him reading and writing, working on what he claimed would be groundbreaking theories about the formation and evolution of human language. To observers, he appeared to be the ideal combination of practical healer and theoretical scholar, a man who could bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern learning. In April 1845, after more than a year of marriage, gave birth to a daughter did Harriet they named Priscilla. Healthy and beautiful was the infant, with her mother's delicate features and what appeared to be her father's intelligent eyes. For a brief time, the arrival of their child seemed to calm Rulloff's volatile nature and bring out genuinely tender qualities that few had suspected he possessed. Devoted to both his wife and infant daughter he appeared, spending hours reading to them from his extensive library and discussing his ambitious plans for their family's future. Frequently spoke Rulloff of opportunities waiting for him in the growing territories of the American West, particularly Ohio, where he claimed to have been offered a position as a college professor. Vivid pictures of the life they could build there were painted by him, away from the constraints and gossip of small-town New York, where his genius would finally receive the recognition it deserved. Reasonable seemed these dreams to Harriet, who had grown accustomed to her husband's grandiose visions and believed in his exceptional abilities. But shattered was the domestic tranquility by the continued presence in their lives of Dr. Henry Bull, Rulloff's business partner and Harriet's cousin. A genuine physician, Bull had taken Rulloff under his wing to teach him botanical medicine, impressed by the younger man's apparent knowledge and dedication. He was also a member of the extended Shutt family network, maintaining the kind of easy, affectionate relationships with his female relatives that was common in close-knit rural communities. Bull's friendly demeanor and family connections, which should have been natural and unremarkable, became the source of Rulloff's growing paranoia and rage. The doctor's habit of greeting Harriet with a kiss on the cheek, the same innocent gesture that had triggered Rulloff's wedding day outburst, drove him into paroxysms of jealous fury. Convinced he became that his wife was having an affair with her cousin, despite the complete absence of any evidence to support his suspicions and the ridiculous nature of the accusation given their family relationship. As spring turned to summer in 1845, reached dangerous proportions did Rulloff's jealousy. He began following Harriet whenever she left the house, questioning her about every conversation she had with other men, and flying into rages over imagined slights and perceived infidelities. The brilliant scholar, who could discuss philosophy and literature with such eloquence, became a monster of suspicion and violence within the walls of his own home. The crisis that would shatter multiple families began in May 1845 when tragedy struck the extended Shutt clan. Gravely ill fell Harriet's sister-in-law, the wife of her brother William, shortly after giving birth to her second child. What appeared to be a serious infection was suffering from by both mother and infant, and the family naturally turned to their relative by marriage, who had established himself as a skilled healer. Agreed to treat them did Rulloff, preparing an herbal remedy using his botanical knowledge and administering it personally to both patients with apparent concern for their welfare. Within 48 hours of receiving Rulloff's treatment, dead were both the young mother and her infant child. While such deaths were tragically common in an era before modern medicine and antibiotics, the timing and circumstances struck some family members as suspicious. No grief was shown by Rulloff at their passing, instead making ominous comments to his mother-in-law about who might go next, words that seemed less like expressions of sorrow and more like veiled threats. An immediate and irreparable rift between Rulloff and the Shutt family was created by the deaths. Whispers began to circulate about whether the supposed healer had actually hastened the deaths of his own relatives, though no one dared voice such accusations openly. The family's previous reservations about Rulloff crystallized into active suspicion and hostility, creating a pressure cooker atmosphere that would soon explode into violence. Feeling the weight of his in-laws' suspicion and increasingly desperate to escape the growing hostility around him, became more determined than ever did Rulloff to convince Harriet to abandon her family and move to Ohio with him. Vivid pictures of the new life they could build in the West were painted by him, where his genius would finally receive proper recognition and where they could escape the small-minded gossips who failed to appreciate his exceptional gifts. But reluctant was Harriet, still grieving the deaths of her sister-in-law and infant niece, to leave her family during such a difficult time. Increasingly violent and frequent became the couple's arguments about their future. Could not understand Rulloff why his wife would choose loyalty to her family over devotion to him, and his frustration fed the paranoid conviction that she was being turned against him by relatives who had never truly accepted him. His jealousy, always simmering beneath the surface, now boiled over into open accusations of infidelity and betrayal. On the evening of June 22, 1845, as a summer thunderstorm rumbled across Cayuga Lake and lightning illuminated the darkening sky, committed the crime that would define his legacy and haunt central New York for generations did Edward Rulloff. Thick with tension was the humid air as another argument erupted between husband and wife in their small house in Lansing, this time about Rulloff's increasingly desperate demands that they leave immediately for Ohio. In the kitchen, engaged in the mundane domestic task of crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle, was Harriet when her husband's rage finally reached its breaking point. He had been drinking, which always made his temper more volatile, and his accusations of infidelity had become more wild and specific. When Harriet laughed off his latest charges and firmly refused his demands to abandon her grieving family, something fundamental snapped in the scholar's brilliant but twisted mind. The sequence of events that followed would be recounted years later when Rulloff finally confessed to the crime, providing details that could only have come from someone who was present during those terrible moments. In the explosion of pure rage, fed by months of building resentment and paranoid jealousy, snatched the iron pestle from his wife's hands did Rulloff and brought it down on her forehead with devastating force. With such violence was the blow delivered that Harriet collapsed instantly, blood streaming from the massive wound and pooling beneath her head on the kitchen floor. The sound of the impact and her falling body seemed to echo through the small house, followed by an eerie silence broken only by the rumble of thunder outside. Stood over his wife's body did Rulloff, watching as the life drained out of the woman he claimed to love, feeling no remorse but only a cold satisfaction that she would never defy him again. But not yet complete was his crime. As Harriet lay dying on the kitchen floor, began to cry in her cradle did their infant daughter, Priscilla, disturbed by the commotion and perhaps sensing that something terrible had happened to her mother. The sound of the baby's wailing seemed to pierce through Rulloff's rage, reminding him that he now had a witness to his crime, a witness who would someday grow old enough to remember and testify against him. With the same calculating coldness that had marked his academic pursuits, made another terrible decision did Rulloff. Moving to his collection of botanical medicines, prepared what he later described as a narcotic likely a concentrated dose of the same plant-based poisons he had been using to treat patients throughout the region. With the precision of a trained pharmacist was the preparation of the fatal dose done, measuring and mixing ingredients with the same care he had once devoted to healing. Returning to the cradle where Priscilla continued to cry, administered the poison with gentle hands did Rulloff, perhaps telling himself that he was simply putting the child to sleep. Gradually weakened and then stopped entirely did the baby's cries, leaving the house filled with the kind of terrible silence that would haunt anyone who had witnessed such evil. In the space of less than an hour, had destroyed his entire family the brilliant scholar, transforming from respected healer to cold-blooded killer. Shockwaves through the close-knit community of Lansing and the surrounding Finger Lakes region were sent by the disappearance of Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff in late June 1845. When concerned neighbors came calling the following day and found Rulloff alone in his house, his explanations raised immediate and profound suspicions that would only deepen with each passing hour. A story that contradicted every explanation their host offered was told by the scene inside the Rulloff home. All the signs of hasty abandonment were borne by the house. Beds were left unmade with sheets twisted and thrown aside, dirty dishes were scattered across the kitchen table where they had apparently been left mid-meal, and personal belongings were scattered haphazardly throughout the rooms. Most tellingly, still sat prominently on her bureau Harriet's cherished traveling basket, which she never went anywhere without, alongside her jewelry and other precious possessions. Only deepened the growing mystery and suspicion did Rulloff's attempts to explain his family's absence. Changed with each telling did his stories, as if he were improvising details as he went along. Initially, he claimed that Harriet and Priscilla had gone to visit relatives in a cottage between Cayuga and Seneca Lakes. But when pressed for specifics, he couldn't provide exact locations or expected return dates. When this story failed to satisfy questioners, he switched to claiming they were visiting family in Erie, Pennsylvania, and finally settled on an elaborate tale about their relocation to Madison, Ohio. More questions than it answered was raised by each new version of events. Why would Harriet leave without her traveling basket and personal effects? How could she have departed without telling her close-knit family where she was going? What circumstances would have motivated such a sudden and secretive departure? The more Rulloff talked, the less believable his stories became, and the more convinced his listeners grew that something terrible had happened to his wife and child. When confronted directly about these inconsistencies, offered to write a letter to his wife did Rulloff, asking her to contact her family and dispel what he characterized as malicious rumors circulating about their welfare. In his precise scholarly hand was the letter duly written, with flowery language expressing concern for her family's worries and requesting immediate communication to set their minds at ease. But days turned to weeks, and no response ever came, a silence that spoke louder than any words could have. For 6 agonizing weeks, maintained his increasingly desperate charade did Rulloff, playing the role of the concerned husband whose family was simply traveling for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Continued his practice as a botanical physician did he, treating patients with the same apparent skill and compassion that had made his reputation, all while knowing that the bodies of his victims lay hidden beneath the dark waters of Cayuga Lake. But stronger and more focused with each passing day grew the community's suspicions. Refused to accept Rulloff's evolving explanations did the Shutt family, led by Harriet's protective brothers, William and Ephraim. Their sister's character intimately knew they, her deep devotion to family, her responsible nature, and her habit of maintaining regular correspondence with relatives. Completely inconsistent with everything they knew about her personality and values was her sudden disappearance without word. The character of a determined manhunt was taken on by the family's investigation, with William and Ephraim Shutt questioning neighbors, searching the surrounding countryside, and applying increasing pressure on their brother-in-law to provide satisfactory answers. Complicated were their efforts by Rulloff's continued presence in the community and his ability to maintain his facade of respectability, but their persistence began to yield disturbing information about his behavior in the days immediately following the disappearance. Several neighbors came forward to report seeing Rulloff on the morning after his family's supposed departure, loading mysterious bundles and what appeared to be a large, heavy chest into a wagon borrowed from the Anderson family. Nervous and furtive, completely unlike his usual confident bearing, was his demeanor described by witnesses. Most significantly, multiple people reported seeing him driving the loaded wagon toward Cayuga Lake in the early morning hours, taking a route that led away from any of the destinations he had claimed his family had traveled to. When the pressure of investigation and community suspicion became too great, suddenly vanished from Lansing did Rulloff, claiming he was going to rejoin his family in Ohio and bring them back to silence the unfair accusations being made against him. Only confirmed the community's worst suspicions about his guilt did his departure in the middle of the night, without settling his affairs or providing any forwarding address. But not content to let his sister's suspected killer escape justice through flight was Ephraim Shutt. A man of considerable determination and physical courage, mounted his buckboard and set off in pursuit did he, beginning a dramatic cross-state manhunt that would take him through multiple cities and railroad stations. A test of wills became the chase between a grieving brother seeking justice and a killer desperately trying to escape the consequences of his crimes. Its climax was reached by the pursuit at a crowded train platform in Rochester, where Ephraim spotted Rulloff attempting to board a departing train bound for Buffalo and points west. In a scene that could have been lifted from the pages of a contemporary adventure novel, attempted to disappear into the crowd of travelers did Rulloff, using his knowledge of human nature and crowd psychology to evade detection. But stronger than Rulloff's cunning proved Ephraim's determination, and after a thorough search of the train cars, found the fugitive hiding in the rearmost compartment did he. Even when cornered, maintained his composure and continued his deception with remarkable audacity did Rulloff. Rather than confessing or showing any sign of guilt, he expressed surprise and pleasure at encountering his brother-in-law, claiming that the meeting was fortuitous since he was indeed on his way to rejoin Harriet and Priscilla in Ohio. With characteristic boldness, he even suggested that Ephraim accompany him on the journey to see for himself that his sister and niece were safe and well. Together in an atmosphere of barely concealed tension traveled the two men, with Ephraim watching his companion's every move while Rulloff maintained his performance as the innocent husband eager to reunite his family. They proceeded to Buffalo where they spent an uncomfortable night at a hotel, each man knowing that the other was playing a dangerous game whose outcome could mean life or death. The next morning, as they made their way to the crowded docks to catch an early steamboat for Cleveland, demonstrated the cunning that would serve him throughout his criminal career did Rulloff. Using the confusion and crowds of a busy port as cover, managed to slip away from Ephraim's watchful eye did he, disappearing into the press of passengers boarding the steamboat. By the time Ephraim realized his quarry had escaped, vanished completely had Rulloff, leaving his brother-in-law alone and more convinced than ever that Harriet and Priscilla were dead. Back in Lansing, organized a systematic search for the missing women did the community that represented one of the most thorough criminal investigations of its era. The focus of their efforts became Cayuga Lake, the longest of the 11 glacial finger lakes in central New York, based on witness reports of Rulloff's suspicious wagon journey. Teams of men worked in shifts using hooks, nets, and primitive diving equipment to search the lake's murky depths for any trace of the bodies. Hampered was the search by the lake's considerable depth and the unclear waters that could hide secrets for decades. For nearly 40 miles extends Cayuga Lake and reaches depths of over 400 feet in some areas, providing countless places where weighted bodies could rest undisturbed. Despite weeks of intensive searching that involved dozens of volunteers and considerable expense, no trace of Harriet or Priscilla was ever found. Increasingly disturbing details about Rulloff's behavior in the days following the murders were revealed by the investigation. Witnesses described his strange alternation between apparent grief and almost cheerful indifference to his family's fate. Most damning was his apparent lack of genuine effort to locate his missing wife and child, behavior completely inconsistent with that of an innocent husband and father whose family had truly vanished under mysterious circumstances. Meanwhile, not been idle during his months of freedom had the brilliant scholar. Continuing his established pattern of reinvention and deception, had made his way to Meadville, Pennsylvania did he, where he established himself under the alias James Nelson. Once again, his charisma and apparent learning opened doors that should have remained closed to a fugitive from justice, and he was soon accepted into the town's intellectual and social circles. In Meadville, befriended a local inventor and businessman did Rulloff, convincing him to enter into a partnership that would have provided both financial security and social respectability. So carefully crafted and convincing was his new persona as James Nelson that he was actually offered a professorship at Jefferson College, a position that would have fulfilled his academic ambitions while providing perfect cover for his criminal past. But shattered were his dreams of respectability when Albert Jarvis, the young man whose family had befriended Rulloff during his time in Ithaca, wrote to inform him that both he and his mother had become convinced of Rulloff's innocence and were working to clear his name. The letter, meant as good news, actually served as a warning that law enforcement officials were closing in on his location and that his time as James Nelson was coming to an end. Inexorably closing in on Edward Rulloff were the wheels of justice, though slow in the 1840s. In 1845, nearly a year after Harriet and Priscilla's disappearance, finally tracked down by determined law enforcement officials was he and arrested on charges related to his family's disappearance. The legal proceedings that followed would span decades and reveal the true extent of his criminal genius as well as the dangerous flaws in the American justice system that allowed such a predator to repeatedly escape punishment. An almost impossible task was faced by the prosecution in trying to convict Rulloff of murder. Without bodies, physical evidence, or eyewitnesses to the actual crimes, they were forced to build their case entirely on circumstantial evidence and suspicious behavior. Recognizing the difficulty of proving murder beyond a reasonable doubt, the grand jury chose instead to indict Rulloff on the lesser charge of kidnapping his wife, a decision that would have profound consequences for the pursuit of justice. With the skill and sophistication of a trained attorney conducted his own defense. Rulloff, demonstrating legal knowledge that astonished court observers and frustrated prosecutors. Relentlessly on the lack of physical evidence, the absence of bodies, and the entirely circumstantial nature of the case against him focused his arguments. With precision did he cite legal precedents, constructed logical arguments that impressed even hostile observers, and cross-examined witnesses with a thoroughness that would have done credit to an experienced trial lawyer. Despite his legal brilliance, convinced of his guilt was the jury by the overwhelming weight of circumstantial evidence and the implausibility of his various explanations for his family's disappearance. In 1846, found guilty of kidnapping was he and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor at Auburn State Prison, one of New York's most notorious correctional facilities. Rather than breaking Rulloff's spirit or reforming his character, became his university and laboratory did prison. With obsessive dedication threw himself into academic pursuits did he, using his confinement to teach himself philology, the scientific study of language development and evolution. Into a scholar's study was transformed his cell, filled with books on linguistics, classical languages, and comparative grammar that he somehow managed to acquire despite the restrictions of prison life. Not merely academic exercises were Rulloff's intellectual pursuits in prison, but part of a grandiose plan to achieve the fame and recognition he believed his genius deserved. What he considered to be revolutionary theories about the formation and evolution of human language were developed by him, working on a comprehensive treatise he planned to title Method in the Formation of Language. Genuinely believed he this work would establish him as one of the foremost linguistic scholars of his generation and earn him immortality in academic circles. To legendary proportions grew his scholarly reputation within the prison. Consulted by guards and administrators on matters requiring education and intelligence was he, tutored fellow inmates in classical languages and mathematics, and even taught classes for visitors who came to witness the phenomenon of the criminal genius. A destination for curious intellectuals and reformers who were fascinated by the paradox of such learning existing within a convicted criminal became his cell. Among those most influenced by Rulloff's apparent reformation and scholarly achievements was Albert Jarvis, the teenage son of the Ithaca undersheriff. Barely out of his teens, but already fascinated by classical learning, became Rulloff's most devoted student did Jarvis, spending hours in his cell studying Greek and Latin under the tutelage of the imprisoned scholar. Crucial to Rulloff's future escape attempts and criminal enterprises would prove the relationship that developed between teacher and student. When released finally was Rulloff in 1856 after serving his full 10-year sentence, found Tompkins County authorities waiting with a new warrant did he. This time charging him directly with the murder of his wife, Harriet. Immediately grasped the implications and potential defenses did his legal mind, and he argued vigorously that this constituted double jeopardy, claiming he could not be tried twice for the same basic crime. Perhaps recognizing the weakness of the double jeopardy argument or simply wanting to avoid a complex legal battle, made a tactical decision that would prove both clever and ultimately futile did the district attorney. Rather than pursuing the charge for Harriet's murder, he dropped that case entirely and instead filed new charges for the murder of infant Priscilla, a separate crime that would not be covered by double jeopardy protections. The second trial, carefully moved to the nearby town of Owego to ensure an impartial jury that had not been influenced by local publicity, again resulted in a conviction and a sentence of death. But not wasted had been Rulloff's legal education during his imprisonment, and his defense team mounted a sophisticated appeal, arguing that murder could not be proven in the absence of a corpse, a legal principle known as the corpus delicti rule. As his case worked its way through the higher courts, generating considerable legal precedent and scholarly discussion, prepared for his most audacious escape yet did Rulloff. In 1858, while confined in the Ithaca jail awaiting the outcome of his appeal, vanished under circumstances that strongly suggested inside assistance from someone with detailed knowledge of the facility's security procedures did he. The most likely explanation for his escape was that Albert Jarvis, now working for his father the under-sheriff and still devoted to his former teacher, had helped orchestrate the breakout. An uncanny ability to inspire loyalty and devotion in those around him had always been possessed by Rulloff, convincing them of his innocence through sheer force of personality and intellectual charisma. Free once again and now a fugitive from a death sentence, embarked on the most productive and dangerous phase of his criminal career did Rulloff. Extensively throughout the Northeast and Midwest traveled he, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement while continuing both his scholarly work and his criminal enterprises. As extremely dangerous and likely to be armed described him as wanted posters, but they could not capture the true nature of his threat, a brilliant mind, utterly without conscience, capable of inspiring trust even while planning betrayal. During these fugitive years, perfected his techniques of deception and reinvention did Rulloff. Under various aliases, worked as a teacher, photographer, inventor, carpet designer, and even photographer did he, always maintaining the facade of respectability while supporting himself through carefully planned thefts and frauds. Continued to open doors that his criminal record would have kept closed did his intellectual gifts, allowing him to infiltrate respectable society repeatedly. In 1861, Rulloff finally did his luck when he was captured and returned to New York to face justice. This time, sentenced to 2.5 years in Sing Sing prison was he, the notorious maximum security facility that housed the state's most dangerous criminals. But even in this harsh environment, managed to thrive did Rulloff, using his intellectual gifts to earn privileges and make valuable connections that would serve his future criminal enterprises. It was at Sing Sing that met William T. Dexter did Rulloff, a professional burglar who would become his partner in the crimes that would ultimately seal his fate. Impressed by Rulloff's obvious intelligence and sophistication was Dexter, recognizing that an alliance with such a brilliant criminal mind could be extremely profitable for both of them. Together with the still loyal Albert Jarvis, formed a criminal gang did they that would terrorize the Northeast for nearly a decade. Sophisticated for the era were their criminal methods, focusing on high-end burglaries that targeted stores carrying expensive fabrics and luxury goods that could be easily transported and sold in distant markets. As the mastermind and planner was Rulloff's role, his superior intelligence allowing him to organize their operations with military precision, while his scholarly reputation provided perfect cover for their activities. Based primarily in Brooklyn, operated throughout New York, New England, and Pennsylvania did the gang, building a reputation for professionalism and avoiding violence that made them particularly difficult for law enforcement to track. Comfortable lives between crimes were lived by them, with Rulloff continuing his academic work and even attempting to gain recognition in legitimate scholarly circles. In 1869, learned of the first convention of the American Philological Association scheduled to be held in Poughkeepsie did Rulloff and saw it as his golden opportunity to break into legitimate academic circles and gain the recognition he had craved for decades. Under the carefully crafted alias Professor Yuri Laurio, submitted a manuscript detailing his revolutionary theory of language formation did he, a work he had been perfecting during his years of imprisonment and fugitive life. The true depth of his megalomaniacal personality and his complete disconnect from reality were revealed by Rulloff's academic ambitions. Genuinely believed he that his linguistic theories would revolutionize the field and earn him immortality as one of history's great scholars. Years of obsessive work was represented by his manuscript method in the formation of language, and convinced was he it contained insights that would transform human understanding of communication and thought itself. To demonstrate his confidence in the work's value and his desperate need for both money and recognition, announced his intention to auction the manuscript for the staggering sum of $500,000 did Rulloff, a fortune that would be worth millions in today's currency. Not just his financial desperation, but his grandiose self-assessment and complete inability to gauge the real worth of his theories or the likelihood of academic acceptance was reflected by the astronomical asking price. When not only rejected his manuscript the Philological Association, but showed no interest whatsoever in his theories, volcanic and transformative was Rulloff's fury. Pushed him over the edge from ambitious criminal to something far more dangerous did the rejection by the very academic community he had spent decades trying to join. If the world would not recognize his genius voluntarily, force them to acknowledge it through increasingly bold and violent crimes would he. All of Rulloff's resentments and paranoid beliefs about society's failure to appreciate his exceptional gifts were crystallized by the rejection. More daring and brutal became his crimes after 1869, as if he were challenging law enforcement to catch him while simultaneously punishing a world that had failed to give him his due recognition. Into something far more dangerous was the brilliant scholar transforming, a killer who felt the world owed him recognition for his superior intellect. It was during this period of escalating violence and desperation that most clearly apparent became Rulloff's true psychopathic nature to those who observed him closely. Virtually every characteristic of clinical psychopathy as we understand it today have been concluded to be displayed by him by modern psychiatrists examining the historical records of his behavior and statements. No genuine remorse for his victims was shown by him, an inflated and grandiose sense of his own importance was possessed, a complete lack of empathy for the suffering of others was demonstrated, and an unshakable belief in his own superiority was maintained, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Yet allowed him to continue manipulating those around him with frightening ease did his charm and intellectual gifts. Even fellow criminals were drawn to his magnetic personality and convinced of his exceptional abilities. Loyalty, devotion, and even love in people who should have recognized him as a dangerous predator could be inspired by him, demonstrating the sophisticated psychological manipulation skills that made him far more dangerous than ordinary criminals. As 1870 dawned, increasingly desperate on multiple fronts was growing Rulloff. Publicly crushed had been his academic dreams by the very scholars whose recognition he had sought. Barely supporting him and his partners were his criminal enterprises, and running short was time for him to achieve the recognition and immortality he believed he deserved. A perfect storm that would soon result in the crime that would finally bring him to justice was being created by the combination of intellectual arrogance, criminal skill, and psychological instability. Word of what seemed like the perfect opportunity to solve their financial problems was brought to Rulloff by Albert Jarvis, still devoted to the man who had educated him in classical languages and convinced him of his exceptional genius. A large and valuable shipment of expensive silks from New York City had recently been received by the Halbert Brothers dry goods store in Binghamton, exactly the kind of high-value, easily portable merchandise their gang had made their specialty. Near the Chenango River was the store's location, providing multiple escape routes, and the presence of only 2 young clerks as night security made it seem like an ideal target for their sophisticated criminal operation. Careful reconnaissance of the building and its surroundings had been done by Jarvis, timing the clerks' routines and identifying the best entry and exit points. Everything seemed perfectly planned for what they expected would be their most profitable score yet. But not the same as academic brilliance was criminal genius, as events would soon prove, and finally lead him to make the mistakes that had eluded him for so many years with Rulloff's intellectual arrogance. The early morning hours of August 17, 1870 were humid and oppressively still as 3 shadowy figures approached the Halbert Brothers dry goods store in Binghamton with the confidence of experienced professionals executing a well-rehearsed plan. Edward Rulloff, Albert Jarvis, and William Dexter had spent days studying the building's layout, the habits of the 2 young clerks who lived above the store, and the best routes for both entry and escape. Typical of their era as shop clerks were Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs, young men from working-class families who lived above their place of employment, both for convenience and security. Increasingly nervous about protecting their valuable inventory had been made store owners by the recent increase in commercial burglaries throughout central New York, and the presence of live-in guards was considered essential protection against the sophisticated criminal gangs that were operating throughout the region. For what was about to unfold was prepared neither young man, nor could they have imagined that they were about to confront one of the most dangerous criminal minds in American history. Into their cots in the quarters above the store had they settled, trusting in their vigilance and the pistol that Merrick kept under his pillow to protect both themselves and their employer's valuable merchandise. Foolproof seemed the burglar's plan, representing the culmination of decades of criminal experience and careful study of human psychology. Through the rear of the building during the deepest part of the night would they enter, subdue the sleeping clerks with chloroform fumes that would render them unconscious without permanent harm, and make off with the most valuable silks before anyone could raise an alarm. The intellectual mastermind of the operation, Rulloff had convinced himself that his superior planning and understanding of human nature would ensure their success. The building's architecture had been studied by him, timed the clerks' routines, and calculated escape routes with the same precision he had once applied to his linguistic theories. Completely in his leadership trusted his partners, convinced that his genius made their operation virtually foolproof. Moving like ghosts through the darkened streets of Binghamton, made their way to the rear of the building did the three men, where a basement entrance provided access to the store's interior. Multiple times had they practiced this approach, and each man knew his role precisely. In the basement, donned masks to conceal their identities did they and removed their shoes to muffle their footsteps on the wooden floors above. Lit was the chloroform and allowed to burn, filling the basement air with its characteristic sickly sweet vapor that they hoped would rise through the building and render the sleeping clerks unconscious. Then, step by careful step, began their ascent toward the quarters where Merrick and Burroughs lay sleeping did they, completely unaware that their lives were about to be changed forever. But undone by a single moment of carelessness can be even the most carefully laid plans, and Albert Jarvis, despite years of criminal experience and careful preparation, made the fatal error that would transform a simple burglary into a murder scene. In the darkness of the unfamiliar building, stumbled over an unseen obstacle did he, perhaps a piece of furniture or a box of merchandise, sending a crash echoing through the structure that shattered the night's silence like a gunshot. Instantly awake were jolted both clerks, their hearts pounding as they realized that the danger they had been hired to prevent was actually occurring. Into chaos had descended the carefully planned operation in the space of seconds, with three desperate criminals facing two determined young men who were prepared to fight for their lives and their employer's property. With remarkable speed and determination reacted Frederick Merrick, displaying the kind of courage that would have made him a hero in any other circumstances. Grabbing the pistol he kept loaded under his pillow for exactly such emergencies, aimed it at the fleeing figure of Rulloff did he and pulled the trigger. Clicked the weapon but failed to discharge, a misfire that would ultimately cost the brave young clerk his life and seal Rulloff's fate as a killer rather than merely a thief. Undeterred by his weapon's failure, seized a heavy wooden stool did Merrick and hurled it at the intruders with considerable force, demonstrating the kind of fighting spirit that marked him as someone who would not surrender easily. Meanwhile, thrown himself at William Dexter had Gilbert Burroughs, and the two men crashed into furniture and walls as they fought desperately in the darkened room, with Burroughs managing to land several solid blows on his opponent. When rushed to help his colleague did Merrick, turning in favor of the defenders seemed the tide of battle, and for a moment, appeared it that the two brave clerks might actually succeed in capturing or driving off their attackers. But it was then that made the decision that would finally bring his decades-long criminal career to an end and transform him from master thief to cold-blooded killer did Edward Rulloff. Drawing the pistol he carried for exactly such emergencies, fired a warning shot into the air did Rulloff, hoping to intimidate the clerks into submission without actually harming them. But yield to threats refused the brave young men, and with such fury and determination threw himself at Jarvis did Merrick that compelled to fire a second warning shot into the ceiling felt Rulloff. When still would not desist Merrick, continuing his attack on Jarvis with the desperate courage of a man fighting for his life and livelihood, completely snapped did Rulloff's patience and self-control finally. In a moment that would haunt him for the remaining months of his life, pointed his weapon directly at the young clerk's head did he and pulled the trigger without hesitation or remorse. Instantly killed was Frederick Merrick by the bullet, striking him where he stood and spattering his blood across the walls of the room where he had lived and worked. The brilliant scholar who could recite ancient poetry in a dozen languages, who had spent years developing theories about human communication and the evolution of language, had just committed the most primal act of violence possible, taking another human life in cold blood. For a moment seemed to freeze time the sound of the fatal gunshot, as if the universe itself was recoiling from the evil that had just been committed. Then Gilbert Burroughs, realizing that his colleague was dead and that he was now facing three desperate killers who had nothing left to lose, made the wise decision to flee and raise the alarm rather than continue a fight he could not win. Racing through the building and bursting onto the street, began screaming for help at the top of his lungs did Burroughs, alerting the entire neighborhood to the tragedy that had just unfolded. Shattered the night air did his cries and brought people running from nearby buildings, including law enforcement officers, who immediately began organizing a manhunt for the killers. In panic fled the scene did the three criminals, racing toward the Chenango River, where they believed they could make good their escape under cover of darkness. But clouded their judgment had fear and desperation, and evaporated had the confidence that had marked their approach to the crime in the face of their transformation from burglars to murderers. Albert Jarvis, perhaps influenced by his scholarly mentor's overconfidence or simply desperate to escape the scene of their crime, assured his companions that the river was shallow enough to wade across safely. A fatal miscalculation it was that would cost 2 lives and seal Rulloff's fate as surely as if he had signed his own death warrant. As plunged into the dark waters of the Chenango did the 3 men, immediately apparent became the true depth and power of the river. Wounded in the struggle with the clerks and weakened by blood loss, Jarvis was quickly overwhelmed by the current and swept away into the darkness. Dexter, who had never learned to swim despite years of criminal activity near various bodies of water, followed his partner into the depths, his cries for help swallowed by the rushing water. Only Edward Rulloff, the mastermind whose brilliant planning had led them to this disaster, managed to struggle to the far shore, gasping and exhausted, but alive. As he dragged himself onto the riverbank, could hear the sounds of the growing manhunt behind him, dogs barking, men shouting, and the organized chaos of a community mobilizing to capture the killers who had just murdered one of their own. Equally disastrous proved Rulloff's attempt to escape Binghamton on foot, demonstrating that even his superior intellect could not overcome the consequences of his crimes. At the railroad station, when police officers asked him to identify himself as part of their systematic search for suspects, made the crucial mistake of running rather than attempting to talk his way out of the situation behavior that immediately marked him as a fugitive and sealed his capture. Almost anticlimactic for a man who had eluded justice for so many years through wit and charm was his apprehension in a nearby farm's outhouse. Finally brought down by his own panic and the simple persistence of local police work was the brilliant criminal who had manipulated judges, juries, and law enforcement officials for decades. Even in custody, attempted to maintain his lifelong pattern of deception and manipulation did Rulloff, first claiming to be Charles Augustus and then George Williams when pressed for identification. But finally caught up with him had his past in the person of Judge Ransom Balcom, a local official who had followed the notorious case for years and immediately recognized the infamous fugitive despite his attempts at disguise. "You are Edward H. Rulloff. You murdered your wife and child in Lansing in 1845, rang through the crowded police station like a thunderclap did the judge's dramatic declaration, finally connecting decades of unsolved crimes to the man who stood before them. Prophetic proved his additional warning to the authorities: this man understands his rights better than you do, and will defend them to the last, as immediately began the legal maneuvering that would mark his final trial did Rulloff. Overwhelming and undeniable was the physical evidence linking Rulloff to the Halbert store murder. Without his shoes had he fled the scene, and the left shoe found at the crime scene was unmistakably his, stuffed with pieces of cloth to accommodate the missing big toe he had lost to frostbite years earlier. As identifying as a fingerprint was made the shoe by the distinctive modification, providing proof that even Rulloff's legal skills could not challenge. Found on the bodies of Jarvis and Dexter when they were recovered from the Chenango River were documents that led investigators to Rulloff's Brooklyn apartment, where discovered a treasure trove of evidence documenting his double life as scholar and criminal. Side by side were found maps, stolen goods, false identification papers, and academic manuscripts, providing a complete picture of the complex man who had terrorized the Northeast for decades. A sensation became the trial that began on January 4, 1871, attracting crowds of over 2,000 people daily to a courtroom built for half that number. Reporters were sent by newspapers across the nation to cover the proceedings, fascinated by the paradox of America's most intellectual killer and the questions his case raised about the nature of genius and evil. Once again, with the skill and sophistication that had impressed legal observers for decades, conducted his own defense Rulloff. But this time, too strong was the evidence and the crimes too clear for even his brilliant advocacy to overcome. A methodical case linking him to the murder through physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and his long history of criminal behavior was presented by the prosecution. Even as he faced certain execution, maintained the grandiose delusions that had driven his entire criminal career did Rulloff. To delay his execution until he could complete his linguistic theories did he petition Governor John T. Hoffman, claiming that his work method in the formation of language would benefit all humanity and that executing him would deprive the world of invaluable scientific insights. Some prominent figures, including newspaper editor Horace Greeley, actually supported this request, arguing that such a brilliant mind was too valuable to waste regardless of his crimes. In the prison in Binghamton, there is a man awaiting death who is too curious an intellectual problem to be wasted on the gallows, wrote Greeley in the New York Tribune. With characteristic wit and insight, satirized these clemency efforts did Mark Twain in a letter to the Tribune, offering to provide a substitute criminal to be executed in Rulloff's place if it would preserve such valuable intellectual property for humanity. The absurdity of suggesting that intelligence should exempt anyone from the consequences of murder was highlighted by his mockery. But failed all appeals, and on March 3, 1871, sentenced to hang for the murder of Frederick Merrick was Edward Howard Rulloff. As he awaited execution, finally confessed to murdering his wife, Harriet did he, describing in chilling detail how he had struck her with the iron pestle in a fit of jealous rage. However, never confessed to killing his daughter Priscilla did he, though he acknowledged giving her a narcotic to stop her crying. On May 18, 1871, before a bloodthirsty crowd of thousands of spectators who had traveled from across the region to witness the execution, met his end at the gallows did Edward Howard Rulloff in what would be recorded as New York State's final public hanging. Either, "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner," or simply, "I can't stand still," were his final words according to various accounts, reflecting the complex mixture of bravado and terror that had marked his entire criminal career. Even in death, continued to fascinate and horrify the public did Rulloff's story. Within hours of the execution, removed his brain for scientific study did Dr. Burt Wilder of Cornell University, declaring it the second largest criminal brain on record at 1,673 centimeters. On display at Cornell's Wilder Brain Collection remains the brain to this day, a macabre monument to one of America's most complex and dangerous killers. Uncomfortable truths about the nature of intelligence, morality, and criminal behavior was forced to confront 19th-century America by Rulloff's case. Prevailing beliefs that linked criminal behavior to low intelligence and social class were challenged by his story, proving that the mask of respectability could be worn by evil and that no guarantee of moral character was intellectual brilliance. Significantly to the development of criminal psychology as a field of study contributed the case, with Rulloff becoming one of the first American criminals to be systematically studied by scientists seeking to understand the relationship between brain structure and criminal behavior. Subjected to every test available to 19th-century science was his preserved brain, but no physical abnormalities could explain the evil that had resided within it. Today, more than 150 years after his death, remains a subject of fascination for criminologists, historians, and true crime enthusiasts does Edward Rulloff, who continue to study his case for insights into the criminal mind. Virtually every characteristic of what we now understand as psychopathy have been concluded to be displayed by him by modern psychologists examining his behavior and statements, making him a textbook example of this dangerous personality disorder. Many of the themes that would define modern understanding of serial killers and psychopaths were prefigured by his story: the charming facade that concealed murderous intent, the grandiose self-image that justified any action, the complete lack of empathy for victims, and the ability to manipulate others through displays of intelligence and charm. In many ways, America's first celebrity serial killer was he, a man whose crimes were overshadowed only by the terrifying brilliance of the mind that conceived them. An eternal reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most civilized serves the case of the genius killer, and that the capacity for evil exists independently of intelligence, education, or social standing. Not the linguistic theories he believed would make him immortal is Edward Rulloff's legacy, but rather the chilling demonstration that genius without conscience becomes a weapon capable of destroying innocent lives. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that exceptional intelligence should ever be considered as a factor in sparing a killer's life? Or does brilliance make such crimes even more inexcusable? Leave your comment below with your thoughts on the case of the genius killer and whether intellectual gifts should influence how we judge criminal behavior. If you enjoyed this tale of 19th century terror and want more stories like this, subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell and share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most civilized and that true evil can hide behind even the most impressive intellectual achievements.